All right, I'm excited about this edition of the Week in Review because I didn't have to talk the whole time. We've got great content this week, though, folks. Our executive editor, Liz Farrell's in the studio to talk about major breaking news in the Murdaugh Murders crime and corruption saga. Just a huge week in that story. Major developments. We're going to cover all of those. It was also a big week in the Bowen Turner saga, the accused teen rapist down there in Orangeburg, South Carolina. There were some developments in his case. We're going to get to those. And also a major upheaval in the South Carolina legislature. We're going to talk about who is moving where, what it means for you as a taxpayer and as a citizen, and also how we're going to continue to hold all of those leaders accountable. All that and more heading your way in the Week in Review. All right, so we're obviously starting with the Murdaughs this week, and Fitsnews broke a metric ton of Murdaugh-related news this week, people. Just huge stories that really advanced the narrative in this crime and corruption saga that folks have been following all across the country for months now. Three big stories, and we wanted to start off our show this week talking about all three of them, giving you some background into how they were broken, what news was broken, and some analysis on what do they mean for the future of this case as it moves forward. And I want to start with the first story because if you look at these stories chronologically, this one goes back, I guess, the furthest. It goes back to the spring of 2021, about 6 weeks before the double homicide at Moselle, which left 52-year-old Maggie Murdaugh and 22-year-old Paul Murdaugh dead. 6 weeks before the double homicide, Alec Murdaugh was the subject of a grand jury investigation into his finances. Now, we knew Murdaugh was already in trouble at the time. We knew that there was a civil case, which was going to compel the production of financial records. And in fact, there was a hearing scheduled 3 days after the murders in the civil case at which Murdaugh was going to be compelled to produce voluminous financial records. In fact, our news director, Mandy Matney, broke that news and detailed that hearing and what Alec Murdaugh was going to be compelled to produce. But what folks didn't know until this week is that there was also a criminal component, that the criminal investigation into Murdaugh's alleged fleecings and various financial irregularities was also underway at that time. Now, did Murdaugh know it? That's the question that we've been trying to answer. I believe he did, and here's the reason. Given the integral involvement of the Palmetto State Bank in so many of these financial scams, which Fitsnews has broken the vast majority of those, given the integral involvement of the bank, it stands to reason that if the bank gets a subpoena, they're going to let Alec Murdaugh know about it. And so there's I believe, better than average chance that Murdaugh was aware not only of this looming disclosure requirement in the civil case, but also that a criminal investigation of his finances was in the works. That's the first big story. And we're going to talk about that as this show unfolds. The other two stories, I think, even bigger. Our executive editor, Liz Farrell, who's here with me today, and Liz is going to be providing some commentary here in a moment. Liz broke another huge story this week, and it involves Maggie Murdaugh, one of the two victims of the double homicide. And what Liz broke, which potentially huge as it relates to this criminal case, the criminal investigation into the double murder. What Liz broke was the news that Maggie Murdaugh was lured to Moselle, that Alec Murdaugh convinced her to come to the property under the pretense that his father was in poor health and that she needed to say goodbye or something along those lines. But again, folks didn't know this. I think folks just assumed that was where she lived or that was, someplace she was regularly visiting. They didn't know that the Murdaughs were actually living apart at the time, that there were problems in the marriage, and that Maggie not only was lured there, but she was hesitant to go, worried about what might happen to her if she did go. So that just a huge revelation in this story. Arguably the biggest news, though, the biggest news in this case, forensic evidence directly linking Alec Murdaugh to this crime scene. And again, Fitsnews exclusively reported back in January that this evidence existed, but we found out this week what it was, and it's damning, people. The evidence indicates that there is high velocity impact spatter. Again, we're not sure whether we're talking about blood yet or some other particulate matter, but high velocity impact spatter on clothing worn by Alec Murdaugh that, again, links him not only to the crime scene, but to the precise moment when at least one of his victims was killed. And again, that's huge. So 3 huge stories, and I want to bring Liz Farrell, our executive editor, in here because Liz obviously broke one of those. She contributed to the other 2 stories as well. Liz, is this the biggest week for Murdaugh news that we've seen basically since Labor Day last year?
Oh, gosh, it feels like it, especially yesterday. It's a smaller story in the grand scheme of what we reported this week, but about the funeral home that Alec appears to have purchased or at least fronted the money for. And, in the midst of that, after the story posted, I had to add another section to it because we found out that one of the alleged victims that he had, allegedly taken money from in the settlement was the son of the funeral home owner, just to make things a little bit more complicated. So, it feels like a fire hose of information for sure.
And we didn't even get the indictments we were expecting, folks.
Right.
One of the things we thought we'd be coming to you this week, detailing new financial indictments against Alec Murdaugh. Those ended up not being dropped this week. We're told they're coming next week. We'll see. But I think this news is much bigger, wouldn't you say, Liz?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. And, when we first reported about the physical evidence that directly ties Alec to the scene at the time of the shootings, there were a lot of people I don't think that put it together necessarily. We really couldn't say at the time, mostly because, like we said in the story, it was being independently confirmed, and that's obviously very important. And, people didn't put it together that, it would be some sort of biological matter that only you could get if you were there during the shooting. So, that's going to be a tough one. I know that there's a lot of people who are online saying, that it's a junk science, high velocity impact spatter is a junk science. It's not. It's a building block that investigators use to make their cases. So it's just going to be one part of a bigger picture that I believe SLED and the AG's office are putting together.
You mentioned a couple of things there that I think are interesting. Maybe expand on a little bit. You mentioned the independent review, this evidence against Alec Murdaugh. It's not just SLED's lab,
No.
which concluded this independently.
Yeah, it's an out-of-state. It's funny because when you look back at sort of the events that happened in the months after the murders, there was a date when the 14th Circuit solicitor recused himself from the case, and that had us all wondering, did something come back? Was it evidence that came back? And I don't know, obviously for certain, but the timing of that, might have lined up in some way with their initial findings of what was on his shirt. So, yeah, I think in a case like this, when you have so much attention and you have, 2 of the most crafty attorneys, I would say, the Bulldog attorneys, they you got to make sure you have everything, lined up. And I think that, it's fair for people, and certainly I'm one of them who, want to see charges faster. They don't understand like why, if there is a suspect, why isn't the suspect been arrested? But understanding that, I think that we can say that things have been done pretty meticulously by SLED and by the AG's office in this case. They really seem to have the bigger picture in their minds right now.
I would agree. And Fitsnews, obviously, we've had an interesting back and forth with SLED at the very beginning of this case when SLED was taking a lot of heat. Obviously, this news outlet defended SLED, defended the investigators working with them. And then obviously a few weeks ago had a little back and forth with them.
All right. Yeah, they were, sometimes, when you have to go to the official agencies and tell them what you know and let them, know that you have good sources and multiple sources at that, they sometimes just don't have a choice but to just, factor that, I guess, into anything else they're doing because, we're going to run with it. And we felt pretty good about it. And I know we're right and we're right.
Absolutely.
And, we knew we were right in January. So, to go back to, I think the Maggie getting lured is another, that's something we've heard for a long time now. And, being able to get that confirmed was important because obviously, when you're talking about like, was the crime an act of revenge? Was it random? Was it, these are two people, Paul and Maggie, who weren't supposed to be there that night. And, we don't necessarily know what the impetus was for Paul to go there. He left his house, he left John Marvin, his uncle's house, around 6, from what we understand. And he, assume went straight to, and we don't know if he went straight to Moselle, but that said, we don't, I don't know that Alec would have known that he was coming, but certainly in Maggie's case, that was an issue. And, I want to make a clarification too. Her hesitancy, it's been presented to us both ways. Yes, fear, was a factor, but we don't know why. So that's not to necessarily, say that she was fearful of Alec or fearful of the situation. But I've also heard it was just, related to, not necessarily wanting to go and visit, Miss Libby and Mr. Randolph and all that. So, I don't know. We don't know what her hesitancy was, but she had a hesitancy. And, if like we keep hearing, and certainly from good sources, that there were marital issues, that's complicated. And, sometimes you just don't want to go because you don't want to see your estranged spouse, or you just, you don't want to put up with nonsense. So I think, we just don't know at this point, but certainly it says a lot that, she wasn't supposed to be there. And unfortunately she was.
That's true.
Yeah.
Let's talk for a minute about the evidence. And again, we were talking earlier about Liz said something I think is very important about sometimes you have to go to your sources and present things that maybe they might not want out.
Right.
But as the editor of this site, I want to make something very clear. We've always done two things. We've never surprised anybody as it relates to the news that we're breaking on this case, and we've always made sure that the stories that we report are not going to compromise the integrity of this investigation.
That is so important. Yeah. I mean, we are very sensitive to that. And, we have a lot of conversations about, so if this is out, what happens? If, how could this be misconstrued? What would this do? And certainly, we have a responsibility to get news out there, because the reason we're doing this is to keep people accountable.
Sure. Including the investigators.
Including the investigators, right. Because it's a signal to them that, they might, think that they have like a sealed up, tank of information, but that's never the case, ever. And so, it's you, like we said, you do run the risk when you are doing the, dot your I's and cross your T's, to the extent that SLED and the AG's office are doing. You do run the risk of information getting out that, you might not necessarily want to get out, because time, plus distance or what have you. I know it's probably like means comedy, but time plus distance means that things get leaked as well. Yeah.
Well, and also, there's been information that we have held.
Oh, a lot of it.
For long periods of time. There's still information that we have not released.
Yeah. And that's the thing. Like we've heard some, pretty compelling information that we'd love to share with people, but we're very considerate, again, of the investigation. There's a time and a place for that information. And, I think probably the time and the place is for SLED and the AG's office to say it, when they're good and ready. But, certainly that's, as far as like the sensationalism, I think that's accompanied this case. We get stuff out fast. We're aggressive, but we're also considerate, and we are always more concerned about the bigger picture and what this means to the people in South Carolina, especially because it's not just about like, oh my God, we got the story first, or we got it. Right. It's about like we know we're doing this for the right reasons, and it's important. Especially this case, because like you said, the story that you broke on Tuesday during the day about, state grand jury, we knew there was an obstruction of justice like that, came out shortly after the murders, but we didn't know that there was a way that Alec might have known, like this, and like you said,
right.
The subpoenas to the banking institution, like, we know their relationship. We know if Palmetto State Bank gets a subpoena, like if your friend got subpoenaed by your, like you probably would tell them. So,
oh, absolutely.
Especially if you have something, to be concerned about. So, yeah, there's a lot of pressure. I mean, I think we've talked a lot about, the pressure that was on Alec and how, sort of unraveling was happening at that time. And it's worse than we thought.
It is. And let's talk a little bit about the evidence that we've been discussing, because I think one of the things that I found interesting over the course of the past week, I had a bunch of folks reach out and say, oh, you got your headline wrong.
Right.
It's splatter, not spatter.
Right.
And I guess everyone also just assumed it was blood, which again is not something we've stated that.
Never.
But you and Mandy were able to have a conversation with an expert on this. Tell us a little
Yeah,
bit.
she was awesome. We spoke with Linda Rourke from John Jay College of Criminal Justice. And she wasn't, just to be very clear, she wasn't speaking about the details of this case. She doesn't know them. And certainly we weren't asking her to do that. But what we wanted to find out more about was the science behind it. What is high velocity impact spatter, and how can that be used to build a case? And is it different if you're talking about blood or if you're talking about other body fluids? And what story does it tell investigators? She gave some really good examples, but Dylan did a video that everyone should watch for sure, because it explains it really well. And but spatter and splatter, certainly. You were saying before about how, what you don't want to say in front of a forensic scientist.
Right. Apparently you're not supposed to say splatter.
No.
Look like
or a cop. Yeah, you definitely don't want to say splatter in front of a cop. They will correct you very quickly. But there's a difference. And again, we made the distinct. We didn't, say that it was blood. We didn't say that it was, anything other than that. It's just, we know that there are markings on his shirt that one could only get if one was there in proximity to one of the victims getting shot.
Let's pull this lens back a little bit, because we've been, ever since June, with the double homicide, and then before that with the boat crash, with the Stephen Smith murder, and then after the double homicide with the crazy Labor Day shooting involving Alec Murdaugh and cousin Eddie, this crazy character who's a key part of this drama. But we've got all these different puzzle pieces, and for months we're looking at this puzzle, not really knowing how everything fits together. As you look at that puzzle today, Liz, is it coming into focus?
It's coming into focus, but I will say, how like the puzzles we did growing up are rectangle and they have edges, and you start with the edges first and then you build on the inside. I think that I've seen these puzzles that don't have any pictures on them, and it's literally just like you have to try every piece, I guess, until they snap into place. This is not only not a rectangular puzzle, it is not a puzzle with a picture on it. So even though things, yes, they're coming into focus, it's you're clearly getting, more pieces are snapping together, but we still don't know why. We don't know what, yes, we know that the boat crash created more stress for the Murdaugh family. We know that obviously the obstruction of justice investigation would have, obviously the pressure to produce his financial records would have done that as well, marital issues, et cetera, et cetera. But we don't know why, what this money was for and who are his associates. I think that's how many more times do we need to say that? But we certainly don't. And, we were talking earlier about how the financial crimes, we've heard from reliable sources that we haven't even scratched the surface of that yet. That is going to be a long investigation and involve a lot of parties, I think.
This thing's just getting started, isn't it?
Yeah. And did you notice on Twitter, there was a lot of people comparing the funeral home connection to Ozark, which is a connection. Didn't Dick Harpootlian say, on national television that
That's
it's
correct.
like Ozark, which made me think he never watched Ozark. He either never watched Ozark or he really knows Ozark and he's giving us a signal. But yeah, it's another similarity with that show. So again, why? We don't know.
Senator Harpootlian certainly told several of his colleagues in the South Carolina Senate in the immediate aftermath of the Labor Day incident that we were looking at a, quote, Ozark situation, end quote, which obviously the addition
So it wasn't on television. I can't remember.
He said it to more than a few people in more than a few settings.
I gotcha.
So certainly that's straight from his mouth, but it fits.
It does, but we just don't know to what extent, right? So again, are we talking about, way beyond our border of South Carolina and the United States? Like, are we talking about an investigation that goes, that's international? I think we are, frankly.
Wow.
Yeah. And to think it all started with a kid wanting to get drunk and drive a boat. It's just not funny, obviously, but it's just like, the tipping point, or like, a butterfly wing, or whatever they say, like a butterfly flaps its wings and it has an effect, a long
Chaos
lasting.
theory. Right?
Yeah, right.
This case has certainly been long on chaos.
Yeah. And it doesn't seem to stop. Like I said, it's rare that you're in the middle, like you've posted a story and you're done, that you don't have like a minor thing to add, like, oh, I didn't think of that. But to have an entire another storyline happens so closely afterward, where you find out that, oh, wow, it's not just this weird thing about a funeral home. It's this other weird thing where the son of the owner is an alleged victim, in which, we're not talking about, $10,000 that was allegedly stolen from this guy. It was $600,000.
A lot of money.
Yeah. And from what I understand, he's the only person who is not represented right now, the only alleged victim of the ones that have been named in the indictments who has not sought representation.
And I don't want to throw shade here, but where's the mainstream media on any of these three stories?
That's confusing to me, especially coming from mainstream media. I don't understand it. I don't understand if this is simply a lack of staff, a lack of sources, or if it's that, they just simply don't like us.
Wait, did you say a lack of staff?
A lack of staff.
That's
true.
Post and Courier has 1,000. They've got they're hiring somebody new every week.
Yeah, it's just us chickens over here. Yeah, you're right. So, okay, lack of staff doesn't make any sense. So lack of sources, that makes sense. But, I think also, maybe I'm thinking too highly of myself probably, and too highly of ourselves. But I do think
that's not possible.
I think the fact that we've dominated this from the beginning and continue to do so. And I think that there's probably a bad taste in their mouth. Because, to cover it is to compete, and, maybe it's easier for them not to, which is a shame because we need them. We need them, working their angles, and it's not to say they're not covering it, but to the extent that it needs to be, no, they certainly are not.
Yeah, this week it was kind of disappointing that there wasn't, some follow-up from them, some additional digging. Again, these outlets have resources we don't have.
Absolutely.
That could be brought to bear on this case, and not only on working sources to try to find out the puzzle,
right,
but also that bigger accountability picture.
Yeah, and the Post and Courier has a wonderful series, that they do that is uncovering corruption all over South Carolina, and those might be considered small cases now with this large one. So I know that all of us, I know everyone has Murdaugh fatigue, I'm sure, but they have to understand that this isn't just a sensational crazy story. This is a way of life for a lot of people here, and this is their lives. This is our lives. We live here. We breathe this. And that's important to note. And where is the mainstream media on the Bowen Turner story as well? That's the one that's Absolutely. So disheartening to me personally, and I don't get it. And I don't know. You can look at the stories that we broke this week with the Murdaugh story. You get okay, we have sources that certainly have come from our 24 years of being adults and in this world. But the Bowen Turner case certainly had elements to it that a mainstream newspaper or television station or what have you, what they could cover from it. And it's important that they do. And I don't know if, again, that's why I start to think is this spite, or is this some sort of if they covered it, that means we need to stay away from it. And we don't want that. We want them to, to stay on top of things here.
Well, I think your point that they need to hear, and I hope everybody listening to this, try to get them involved, because again, we need all of us, all hands on deck, not only on this story, but on the Bowen Turner story, as you mentioned, but again, the bigger picture of institutional corruption in this state. And that's where I think the mainstream media has been the most asleep at the wheel. They accommodate this, ongoing judicial leniency problem, the bonds, the weak sentences, these sweetheart deals for people like Bowen Turner, who are represented by these powerful lawyer legislators. And again, I don't know if they're access whores, if they just want to keep the access to these powerful politicians. I don't know what it is, but I'll tell you what, that is never going to be a problem for this news outlet, because we're going to go hard to the paint. We're going to be aggressive with all these elected officials, appointed officials.
Well, I think people respect you more. I mean, that's certainly, I think, something that you've found in your career, I found in my career, is that, I think that, certain judgments can be made, like, oh, that reporter's friends with this person, or, I saw them hanging out together, those kinds of things, where it's not, I think everybody in my life, and my sources in particular, they know that, if they do something wrong, they're just as susceptible to my scrutiny. They're just as susceptible to our publication scrutiny. And so I think, that's sort of the misconception. So we make these characterizations or these judgments of mainstream media because of that accessibility, because we know that's a real thing. But I have to say, I mean, I found in my career that, I worked for the Beaufort County Sheriff's Office for about a year, and I had written many critical pieces about that agency. And, people, I just found that, maybe certain people will cut you off, but the ones that, understand what you're doing and why what you're doing is important won't.
Absolutely. Executive Editor Liz Farrell holding forth on the big news in the Murdaugh Murders, crime and corruption saga this week. There, like I said, there was a ton of it. Count on Fitsnews to continue breaking that news, to continue providing you with our analysis of it, and most importantly, continuing to hold everyone associated with this saga accountable. All right, so as we mentioned in the last segment, there was also some news this week related to the saga of Bowen Turner. And if you followed Fitsnews for the last few weeks, you are very familiar with this kid, 19-year-old alleged teen rapist, accused of assaulting 3 different women over a period of a little over a year back in 2018 and 2019. One of these cases was dismissed earlier this month. One of these cases was pled down to a simple assault. Bowen Turner was not required to register as a sex offender. He was given probation. This controversial sentence created national attention, national outrage. Fitsnews has been following the saga from the very beginning. And this week, something interesting happened. And I brought Liz Farrell in here to talk a little bit about this as well, because it's one of those things where you have a controversy, there's press coverage, and then you have people in power say, oh, well, wait a minute, wait a minute.
Yeah, I feel like you should. It's one of those things that you want to celebrate, like the fact that they're going to potentially reopen the cases, because obviously, anyone could tell you that they felt like justice wasn't done there. But it doesn't feel right. It shouldn't take that. It shouldn't take, the bravery of the victims' families, of the victims. I mean, it's amazing. And I hope, that's going to, moving forward, help that conversations like this happen with more ease and less shame. I think that that's going to be a good thing. But that said, I'm very confused by what's happening here, other than, there's no excuse for what happened, and they can't make it right. They can't reconcile it, through excuses. So I assume that this is their potential solution. I don't know.
Well, and potential is the key word. And as I was reporting on this over the course of the week, I kind of look at it as a long shot, and we'll tell you quickly what's going to happen, or what's reportedly going to happen. The Office of Second Circuit Solicitor Bill Weeks, which handled this case, handled actually all 3 of the Bowen Turner cases, is reportedly considering taking evidence to a county grand jury, what they call a direct presentment of evidence, in the hopes of gaining indictments against Bowen Turner in relation to one of these alleged sexual assaults. And the assault in question would be the case of Dallas Stoller. Dallas, obviously, no longer with us, a tragic loss last fall. Her family still grieving her. Was hoping for some justice this month. They didn't get it, Liz.
No, I mean, they're going to be grieving her for the rest of their lives. And, they've done right by her. And I would like to see, the powers that be in the state do right by her as well. And I just, to revise something that you said earlier, they're women now. These are young girls. I mean, these are 16-year-old girls. And he's a young man as well. And he was sentenced under the Youthful Offender Act, even though he was going to be tried as an adult. Obviously, the other issue would be like, the GPS monitoring stuff, which we're going to get into, in the future a lot. But yeah, I hope justice is done. But I mean, at this point, I can't wrap my head around how reopening, like, I just don't know how that works. And I don't know how you can strike a deal, with a defendant or his attorney and then backtrack. So, if this is just sort of a symbolic thing or something that people are doing for show, or I don't know. It's like they stuck their fists into two big hams and they're just not sure how to pick up a pen anymore. Because they're really not handling this well.
Ham-fisted, literally.
Ham-fisted, yeah, exactly.
Well, and you raised a good point. Are they doing this just because they got called out?
Well, yeah, right. I mean, you see that over and over again with people in power and lawmakers and solicitors, whoever it might be, chiefs of police, whoever it is. But when you run out of things to how to justify yourself, if you have nothing left, the only thing you can do is like a moonwalk back. It's just like, I don't know. Your time machine's not working. That's what I would tell them, because it's, you had the chance to do something the right way the first time. And this isn't to say, Bowen deserves his day in court as well, to defend himself. But what our argument is that, he wasn't provided a defense. I mean, he was provided a heavy hitter just to sit there. And I'm not to say he didn't work. I don't know if Senator Huddle, I don't know the extent of that, obviously, but certainly his presence, brings with it a certain amount of power alone.
Particularly in that courtroom.
Particularly in that courtroom. And, it was an issue for him, back before, like years ago. This, it's come up several times in his career, actually, where he, each time he says, I'm going to assure you that nothing is wrong here. This is how it's done. This is all normal. There was a state trooper who, I think we spoke at this last week, but or 2 weeks ago, who, said that he dropped tickets, a lot, because once he saw that Senator Huddle was the defense attorney, it was like, what's the point? The judge is just going to agree with him. So, yeah, I mean, that's it. Like, everyone deserves a defense. But again, was he provided a defense, or was he, did they bring in the Godfather or somebody just to sit there with their arms crossed and be like, take care of this?
Well, this is one of the things that I'm most excited about, the documentary that we're preparing. We've mentioned this last week. Our director of special projects, Dylan Nolan, has been working tirelessly on a documentary because this story just hit us on such an elemental level.
Right.
And one of the questions that I don't want to give too much away about that production that we're working on, but one of the questions we posed to some of the victims' advocates and the victims' attorneys was, look, certainly everyone has the right to the best legal counsel they can get.
That's what makes a democracy, right? That's why our system allegedly works.
But when does it cross the line from advocacy in the courtroom that, is, again, the best lawyering you can have, to a wink and a nod after court between the lawmaker who appoints the judge?
Right.
I mean, that's gaming the system.
Right. And like you look at, to begin with, what does a defense attorney like to do? They like to delay the case as much as possible in the hopes that, circumstances change. Witnesses no longer want to talk. They leave the state. Things become more difficult. And that's the point of that, right? And unfortunately, in this case, delaying it led to a death because, it's the strain, the pressure of having to live that, and to find out, he wasn't. You said he wasn't indicted in Dallas Dollar's case, right? Or we don't think he was.
No.
Yeah, and I don't know. I don't know what the excuse for that is, because especially when you're talking about the breadth of crime, right? You have, car break-ins, all of that stuff. I always laugh about this because whenever there's like a burglary charge or something, you never really say like the alleged victim of the burglary. And you never said alleged, like the alleged victim, or she was they were allegedly burgled or whatever the word is. They were allegedly stolen from. But it's, but anything, with a sexual assault case becomes a very it's the burden of proof is on the alleged victim, and it's like that's just what our brains are trained to hear and say. And so it's like you see the breadth of crime, you see that there's just a ton of property crime everywhere. These are actually like violent crimes that occur in the community that should be somewhat of a priority, right, for prosecutors, because that's what we want law enforcement to be doing. We don't want our cars to be broken into. We don't want our homes broken into. Like, all that stuff is important too. But when you have actual violent crimes happening against people, those certainly should take priority, in my opinion. But
the other thing as it relates to Senator Hutto that I think is important to point out, not only the position of influence he has in Orangeburg, the position of influence he has as a state senator, but one of the key components of this case was the bullying of the victims on the part of supporters of Bowen Turner. And I want to make sure everybody knows, back in 2019, Fitsnews published a story about Senator Hutto slut-shaming one of these victims. And so, again, you talk about everything that went wrong with this case institutionally. When you've got a guy with that kind of power who goes out and defends himself in the aftermath of this as some hero of women. I've seen some of Senator Hutto's Facebook responses. He slut-shamed this poor girl.
Yeah, and like to call it slut-shaming is interesting because it's like, okay, well, there's a lot of shame involved in, being sexually assaulted. And that is just, so for a victim to express what is a natural response to having your body violated by another person without your permission, violently so in this case, he took an element, he took what was, how she felt, probably what she told, I would imagine what she told investigators, I feel ashamed, because it doesn't feel good, right? So it doesn't feel good now to be labeled, something happened to her, now she has to bear the burden of that. He takes that thing, that element, and uses it to the point he was even making in that case. We're talking about, I believe it was the bond hearing where he said that. How is that an argument? And again, we go back to providing a defense, right? How is her feeling ashamed an argument for Bowen, who, by the way, is out on bond on another sexual assault case at the time? How is that an argument to say that this guy, when you're trying to look at the thresholds for bond, which is, is this person a flight risk? And guess what? Are they a danger to the community? And so how is it like you're trying to say that this girl consented and if she says she felt ashamed by it, not liking it isn't the same thing, not regretting it's not the same thing as sexual assault. And not understanding just how, there is a more sensitive way probably for him to say that, not that that's his job in that role, but certainly, that's what these girls have to go up against. And the bullying never stopped. After we've published our stories, the bullying continued. And there was obviously Sarah Ford, the attorney for the victims, filed wanting to expand the permanent, what is that called? My gosh, it's restraining order, the permanent restraining order, I apologize, that, the court had put onto Bowen not to contact the victims or their families. And they wanted to expand it to include everyone in Bowen's family too, because, the parents of Dallas Solar said that they were getting phone calls from, Turner's, at least his mother, possibly, and another male caller on behalf of Turner. So
the harassment never stopped.
Never stops.
Never stopped. And the other thing that I want to point out, I want folks to hear this because it matters. The Dallas Stoller case, there was direct physical evidence.
Yeah.
Compelling physical evidence, photographed, documented. There were witnesses, more than one.
Yeah.
This wasn't a case where it was, her death eliminated the likelihood of prosecution. I understand that you have a right to confront your accuser. That's part of our system. But this was a case where there was a body of evidence and witnesses that could speak to what happened.
Right. And again, it goes back to we have these legislator lawyers who, can stall cases as long as they want, even more than the average defense attorney. Because of the privilege of, when they're in session, they don't have to, work on their cases, I guess, or have to trial that. I'm not really sure what the rule is there, but, you push it back and you push it back because, they know it's a strong case. And, there are a lot of things that went wrong there. And I hope, honestly, and not to scold people, but I really hope that they're examining their souls on this one because, when you're sort of searching your brain for why did I do that thing that's messed up? usually you can come up with some sort of justification for, behavior that you're not proud of, but I just don't know how any of these guys are going to be able to look at what, their decision making, the things that they signed off on, either was, they took the path of least resistance. They were self-preservationists for their own career aspirations, or didn't want the trouble, didn't, want the hassle. But at the end of the day, you have, in my opinion, they have blood on their hands, and it's a strong statement, and I mean it.
Well, I don't argue with it, and I don't think anybody that's followed this case will argue with it either. Count on Fitsnews to continue following this case, and once again, just as we mentioned in the last segment, count on us to continue holding the institutions and individuals responsible for these decisions accountable. All right, so while it was a huge week on the Murdaugh front, it was also a tremendous week of action at the South Carolina State House, a major upheaval, particularly in the South Carolina House of Representatives. If you're a regular part of our audience, you knew this was coming. We were the first outlet to report on the impending resignation of current South Carolina House Speaker Jay Lucas. For those of you unfamiliar, that's the most powerful position in the House of Representatives. And given how the House has stricter rules of debate than the Senate, where one lawmaker can basically tie things up, that House leadership position is incredibly powerful. Basically controls the direction of the chamber, the committees, so an incredibly powerful position in state government. Jay Lucas, a friend of mine, although as you may have seen in a segment we taped earlier this week, wasn't too impressed with his performance in this role, at least as it related to outcomes for the people of South Carolina, for taxpayers and citizens in South Carolina. But former Speaker Lucas is on his way out. The new Speaker of the House, Merle Smith, an attorney from Sumter, South Carolina. Merle Smith is another friend of mine. I actually used to help him out on his political campaigns way back in the early aughts when he was first coming up as a member of the South Carolina General Assembly. Good guy, takes criticism well, but again, heavy is the head which wears the crown. And so there's a lot on Merle Smith's plate now where he is going to have to produce results. Again, the same outcomes, standards that I held former Speaker Lucas to, I'm going to hold Speaker Smith to. That's the kind of accountability that you deserve, again, as a citizen, as a taxpayer of this state. So Merle Smith, the new Speaker of the South Carolina House, that was just the first domino, though. Several other dominoes fell after that. In Smith's place, as the chairman of the powerful House Ways and Means Committee, which is the budget committee, basically, they decide how your money gets spent, or at the very least, have the first crack at it. Replacing Smith as chairman of that committee on an interim basis will be outgoing Majority Leader Gary Simrell. Now, Gary Simrell already announced that he's stepping down at the end of his term. He's not running for re-election in 2022. So that means this seat will come open. That's a three-way battle right now. There are three lawmakers vying for a longer-term chairmanship of that committee. They are Bruce Bannister. He's a former majority leader out of Greenville. Bill Herb Kurzman, a lawmaker out of Bluffton, South Carolina. And then we've got Philip Lowe, who's a lawmaker out of Florence. And Lowe actually got some rare plaudits from this news outlet recently when he upped funding in the state budget for law enforcement at a time where there are critical shortages of law enforcement funding. So Philip Lowe making a late push as one of the contenders in that seat. So as all this unfolds, again, we look at the musical chairs. We see who these new names are. And again, you've heard the Who song, people. Everybody knows the song. Meet the old boss, same as the new boss. South Carolina, it's been that song, And instead of not being fooled again, we are perpetually fooled in South Carolina. I don't know if it's whether they keep dumbing down the schools every year, but the same politicians, just different names, folks. Same politicians, different names, but the same terrible results. I'm talking about economic results, academic results, public safety, infrastructure. I mean, you name it, South Carolina is dropping the ball, bottom line. And so I wrote a column this week as Chairman Smith elevated to the position of Speaker Smith. He's the new leader of the South Carolina House. I wrote a column challenging him personally to enact the sort of reform that you deserve, again, as a taxpayer, as a citizen of this state. And just to preview a few of those things I'm talking about, first and foremost, tax reform. South Carolina has got to get competitive with its neighboring states on taxes, or else we're going to continue to be left behind economically. So we've got that, which is absolutely critical. Choice for parents. Every parent in South Carolina ought to have at least $7,000 of that $17,000 that the state is spending per year per child on one of the worst public education systems in America. Again, give parents a chunk of that money, regardless of where they live, what they make, what color their kids are, whether their kids have special needs or not. Give them a chunk of that money. Empower them with choice in the marketplace. Because again, unless there's market-based pressure on our government-run school system, it's going to continue to fail, no matter how many more billions and billions of dollars we pour into it. So that's important. I want to talk about infrastructure reform. We've got a massive backup around the interstates in Columbia. Interstate 85 in Greenville is an absolute death trap in and around there. These are core infrastructure needs, folks, that have gone unaddressed for decades, in some cases, while our politicians give money to select corporations for pet projects. I mean, just go look up in York County. We just spent tens of millions of dollars on an interchange for the Carolina Panthers for their new practice facility. And guess what? The Panthers pulled out of the deal. They pulled out of the deal. Could we have used that money for some of these core interstate needs? Absolutely. Absolutely. So we've got to better prioritize infrastructure in this state. We've got to privatize things that government shouldn't do. And I'm looking at Santee Cooper, a state-run power company, which literally was involved in a $10 billion boondoggle on a botched nuclear power facility. $10 billion of your money gone, vanished. And the people who were responsible for that, again, the lawmakers. But, of course, they all get a hall pass on it. There's no accountability, and they continue to run this power company under state control. The ports. 10 years ago, South Carolina had the number 4 port in the country in Charleston, one of the busiest ports in America. We have since been completely bypassed by the Port of Savannah, running circles around Charleston. And yet we continue to allow a bunch of political appointees to run this port. Oh, and by the way, while we do that, we also have the last undeveloped port location in America waiting in Jasper County, where we desperately need jobs and investment. And port leaders refuse to build it. Again, get government out of things it shouldn't be doing. Put the private sector in charge of those things. All of these are things that Speaker Merle Smith needs to work on. And those are all things I challenged him to do. One more thing, though, and you know where we're going with this because we talked about it in the last 2 segments. Judges. South Carolina must elect judges. It is past time. Get lawmakers, and particularly lawyer legislators like Speaker Smith. And again, I'm not saying he abuses it more than his colleagues. I think there are other lawmakers who abuse that power far more. But none of them should have the right to abuse that power. None of them should have that power. In fact, if we have learned anything in the last few months in South Carolina, in the last few years, as the Murdaugh Murders saga has unraveled, as we see cases like the Bowen Turner case that we talked about earlier in this show, if we've learned anything in this state in the last few months, we've learned that it is past time for the South Carolina General Assembly to get out of the business of electing judges. It is past time. And if we're not going to let the public elect them, at the very least, folks, let's make them gubernatorial appointments with the public able to then affirm them through either a recall election if they misbehave, or a retention election in a year or 2. So again, some sort of public accountability there, direct accountability over judges. If you want to read those challenges, check it out. But once again, keep it tuned to Fitsnews, not only to get the heads up on what's going to happen within those chambers, which we were, once again, first on the scene with that information, but more importantly, to understand why it matters and to understand that we are continuing to hold all of these leaders accountable for their actions. All right, so that's a wrap for the show. I want to cover a few housekeeping. First of all, yes, I have a pop here. This is a pop. It's not a booze pop, unfortunately, although that was a big issue in the South Carolina legislature this week. They are trying to ban booze pops. And I don't understand that, because shouldn't you be able to, if you're 18 years old or whatever it is, 21? Is it 21? I'm old. If you're 21 and you want to be able to drink, you should be able to drink beer, liquor, whatever. And if you want to put it in a popsicle like this, got a little too good at that one. Let's cut that. Oh, damn, you already got it in there. Anyway, if you want to consume your booze through a frozen confection like this, why not? Why are we banning that? That seems utterly ridiculous. But anyway, we had a nice op-ed on Fitsnews this week from Louis Gossett, former executive director of the South Carolina Manufacturers Alliance. Louis published an op-ed explaining why he supports booze pops and why he doesn't think they should be banned, and I agree with him. But whether I agree with them or not, the point there is our microphone is open. If you have a view on an issue, whether it's related to these frozen confections or something else that you're passionate about, send it to us. Whether we agree with it or not, if it's an intelligent take, we will run it, folks. Because again, Fitsnews, we're here to host a conversation. We want to tell you what we think. We want to try to convince you we're right. But we also want you to try to convince us and try to convince our audience. It's an open microphone, folks. This mic, always on, always open. Last housekeeping, I just want to mention we're available now on Apple and Spotify. So if you get your podcast action there, I really don't know what podcasts are. I apparently have one now, but maybe too many booze pops, right? One too many booze pops. Damn it, Dylan, you videoed me sucking it again. Anyway, check us out on Apple and Spotify. If you want to support us by advertising on any of these platforms, let us know. We'd love to have you. Our audience is growing. And again, keep it tuned to Fitsnews for all your latest South Carolina political news, justice news, everything related to the Murdaugh crime and corruption saga, all that and more, always heading your way with booze pops this week on the Week in Review.